Okay, so welcome along to the Habit Shift. I am Sandy, and as always, I'm with my lovely friends. We've got Ian and Sarah and Jeff, all in different countries, except for Ian and Sarah, both in the same country, but in different parts of the country. How you guys doing?
We're good, thank you.
Very good, thank you, Sandy.
Yes, me too.
Good. And we're up to episode 9 for the Habit Shift. And today we're going to be talking about carbohydrates. And this is my favorite subject. I don't know whether it's because it's carbohydrates, because I love carbs, as we all do. Or maybe for the fact that I guess it's the most demonized food of all the food groups when it comes to dieting. So I guess that's one of the reasons why I probably like talking about it too. What about you guys?
Yeah, definitely. It's one of, carbs is a big part of my food choices every day. And so very important thing to me. It's very important. All of my favorite foods typically involve carbs in some way. And so, yeah, I'm definitely like you. I would not go keto even for a large sum of money.
Nor me.
Neither
So
myself. No, I love carbs too, Sandy. We're on the same page there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess there's a few things that we can basically cover with carbohydrates. So I think probably the best place to start is, well, we start with some myths. Maybe we should start with some myths about carbohydrates. Or do you think we should start with what they actually are? Who wants to start with that?
Go on, Jeff. I did protein last week.
All right. Well, that sounds
the carbs.
good.
Let's start with what they are, and then we can go down the rabbit hole of why people believe they are, in fact, the devil. Yeah.
Well, they're these microscopic demons that they carry fat and they stuff them into different parts of your body, and that's basically how they work. No, but so carbohydrate it's just one of the main macronutrients. So the macronutrients all provide us with with energy. So micronutrients are vitamins and minerals. They don't really give us energy, but they do other beneficial things for our body. And so carbohydrate is one of those macronutrients that provides energy for us. So each gram of carbohydrate gives us about 4 calories worth of energy. And it's the stuff that's found in things like grains, and legumes has it, and even dairy has some in it, and vegetables, fruit, potatoes, all kinds of different foods like that have carbohydrate. And basically what it is it's happens to be the body's preferred source of fuel. Our brain runs on, well, what carbohydrate is, it gets converted into glucose, which the body then uses, or sugar, which the body uses for energy. So that energy is used for brain function, for various other activities throughout the day. And the body does store it, and we may use this term may come up in our discussion, stores it in what's called glycogen. And glycogen is stored in the muscles and the liver. And that's basically the kind of the storage form of carbohydrate that the body uses, so that it can store it when we eat it and has it available whenever it's ready to use that, or when it needs to use that fuel source. And and carbohydrate happens to be the one that does spike insulin more than other nutrients. Of course, we'll probably talk about that some too, whether that's necessarily a bad thing or not. So hopefully that's a good, very brief summary. Fiber is actually considered a carbohydrate, but it's something that the body can't really use much for energy. So it can't use as much of that for energy. And so, so that's a sort of real quick rundown on it.
And I guess, unlike the other two, we can actually survive without carbohydrates. We don't have to have them to live, which is why I think you'll find these like no carb or very low carb diets where you don't find that when it comes to protein and fat, because those are both essential to us. However, it probably isn't optimal, because as Jeff said, our preferred source of fuel is glucose, and without that, yes, we'll function, but we may not function optimally.
Yeah, really good point there. And our body uses these different fuel sources based on the level of and kinds of activity that we're involved in. So carbohydrate is something that's needed for that higher intensity exercise. And part of why it's so beneficial there is that it's very quickly used. So the body can take carbohydrate, energy from carbohydrate or that glucose, and it can turn it into, we won't go into the details there, but the low level energy currency of the body, ATP, it can create this much quicker than it can from fat. And so that's why when we're doing high intensity stuff, our body's going to be burning more carbohydrate. When we're just like what we're doing right now, just sitting here talking, we're probably burning more in terms of fat for fuel.
And that's where people get confused, isn't it?
Exactly.
Because they think if they're going to cut out one of those, then they're going to lose weight, but overall calories still counts no matter which fuel you're burning.
Yeah, I think people get confused, that whole fat burning thing, particularly if they've got a treadmill in their gym, or some sort of cardio equipment, and it's got the fat burning zone. They automatically put two and two together and assume if I'm working at that intensity, I am exclusively burning body fat, when in actual fact you are more likely just burning the nutritional fat that is within your system. And to tap into body fat stores, we must burn the totality more calories than we intake through our diet.
Yeah. And
yes,
sorry, go on, Sandy.
I was just going to say, I think people get confused about what carbohydrates actually are. Like, I think for the most part, people just tend to think that they're, donuts and pies and, things like that, but they don't realize there's so much more to it than that, because carbohydrates in those sorts of forms are not just carbs, they're carbs and fat most of the time. And that's what makes it taste so damn good, is because they've added the fat in there as well. So it's not just made up of carbs. So what people don't understand is that, there's veggies are carbs, fruits are carbs, and all the other stuff that are carbs, like flour and rice and pasta, they're carbohydrates as well. So there's a lot of confusion about what they think is actual carbohydrates.
And that list you've given is all very nutritious, healthy food that we should be including. And you cut a lot of that out, and you will be missing out a lot of nutrients. Yeah, you're not going to hurt yourself if you cut out, chips and white bread too much, but the rest of the stuff you're going to miss out a lot on if you cut that out. And I think that's what tends to happen, is people's fiber goes right down when they cut out carbs, and then your system isn't too happy.
No. And the other thing with carbohydrates as well is that sometimes, depending on what it is, but it doesn't satiate you as much as what say protein does, depending on what it is, of course. I mean, the most satiating carbohydrate or food that there is potatoes. But, in terms of other foods, and I think this is dependent on each person as well. Like for me, with some things, I can eat, say, I just say that I wanted some Special K. I had some Special K one day in a bowl. I don't know whether you have Special K over there, but Special K cereal.
Yeah.
I just felt like having that. I normally have oats because that fills me up for, quite a few hours. But I had Special K one day, so I thought I'd have that and a bit of yogurt. And within an hour, I was totally starving after I had that, even though it had a little bit of protein as well. So that type of carbohydrate for me just doesn't satiate me at all. But when I eat potatoes, and like I said, potatoes being the most satiating food on the index, like that's really, really filling for me. And I'd say for most people as well. So I guess it's that satiation as well that people don't understand. And it's easy to overeat things that are, you know, highly calorific, like donuts and, you know, sugar and stuff like that. So it's not going to be as satiating as, say, potato or fruit or something like that.
It tends to be what people do to it as well. If you take a massive pile of rice that's plain or pasta that's plain, you're probably not going to eat too much of it. But when you put a creamy, cheesy sauce or something on it, the same with potatoes, you know, a humble potato, which I have to say is one of my favourite foods in the world. I could not live without a potato in my life. It's what you do to it.
English.
Oh yeah, I know. I have to have potatoes. When I had to do the low FODMAP diet in the past, I was just like, oh, what can't I eat? And when they said I could eat potatoes, I'm like, okay, I'm okay. I can go without anything else, but just not potatoes. But we deep fry them. We add cheese and butter to them. We do all those things, which of course make them taste absolutely yummy. But it's not the potatoes' fault. It's not the pasta's fault. It's all the accumulation of mostly fat, actually, that's added to it that makes it taste so good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these ultra processed forms of carbohydrates, like they're never just purely carbohydrates, as Jeff said. It all kind of ends up as glucose in our system, you know. So the more complex the form of carbohydrate, the longer it takes time to break down. And then if we start mixing it in with like protein as well, that really slows down that kind of gastric emptying, that like the digestion of all of those sorts of things. But these ultra processed things, we're able to pretty much extract more calories from them also, versus like a more whole food based diet, your fruits, your vegetables, all of that sort of stuff. The body has to really work to get through all of that, especially when the higher in fiber. And having dieted successfully numerous times to lower percentages of body fat, there's almost, for me personally, a transition when I do that to even more whole stuff, and particularly potatoes. They seem to be the kind of, I know we spoke a little bit about the bodybuilders sort of diet last week and in the protein chat, and then we also talked about like the palatability of the diet. And so there's a reason why kind of these really bro bodybuilders go ultra bland, because there's only so much plain potato and plain rice. It doesn't need to be at that extreme, but they're not just simplifying the management of the calories through going solely single ingredient. They're also like muting the desire to eat more of those foods as well. So as you said, like rice with additional chili on or whatever, we add flavor because it makes it more palatable. And the world is just, I mean, especially manufacturers are just designed to kind of make you buy their product and keep coming back for that. So there is that bliss point that we need to be mindful of with those ultra processed foods, and the fact that they have a large amount of nutritional fat, particularly trans fats, which we know is linked to things like heart disease and CVD and all of that sort of stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important way to look at at carbs, is really how they impact your body, how they make you feel. Like what Sandy was talking about there, switching out Special K for oats. I have the same thing. If I go with cereal instead of my typical oats in the morning, I'm usually hungrier earlier in the day, where the oats will get me through until lunchtime, no problem. And that's just one of those things that each person has to kind of find for themselves and experiment with. And so I think that's good. One of the things too, kind of at the technical level as far as carbs, is that carbs stimulate insulin, like we said, because insulin is what takes the glucose out of the bloodstream and puts it into the muscles and all of that good stuff. But one of the other interesting things with with insulin is that it's not just a storage hormone, it's actually a satiety hormone. So a lot of people say, oh, if you eat carbs, all it's going to do is just make you hungrier and hungrier and hungrier. And that's really not the case. And I think it comes back to, well, yeah, if you're eating just a bunch of sugar as carbs, then, or highly processed carbs, then yes, you do find that it doesn't satiate you as long. But one of the roles of insulin is that it does provide satiety. It when insulin gets released, it tells the body that you don't need any more food, which makes sense because it knows it got some. And so so it is important to understand that it's not just the storage hormone. It actually has these other benefits as far as managing appetite. And protein is a satiating macronutrient, so is fat, and they all kind of interact at different times throughout the process. And so by combining all of them together, you really get kind of a good balance of knocking out your hunger immediately and combining those other macros, and it'll sustain you for a period of time.
We should probably talk about why people think they're losing so much more weight when they cut carbs out. Because what happens is people think that they always judge it solely on a scale weight. So they'll weigh themselves and they'll go on this low carb diet, and within a week, maybe 10 days, they've lost, upwards of half a stone, and they think that's amazing. Sorry, 7 pounds. For people that don't work in old money, I don't know what that is in kilograms. Anyone help me out on kilos?
No,
a little over 3 probably.
So anyway, a substantial amount of weight in a quick amount of time. And yes, you have lost weight, the number has gone down on the scale, but you haven't necessarily lost body fat. And this is where people get really confused, because when we have carbohydrates, we store water alongside. So it makes sense that when we don't have carbs, we lose that water weight alongside. And that's what's reflecting on your scale number, is the fact that you've lost an awful lot of water weight from not taking in those carbs. And then what then tends to happen is most people can't survive or enjoy living without carbs for too long. So they put them back in their diet, they get back on the scales, and they're like, oh no, I've put that 7 pounds straight back on. I knew it was the carbs fault. And actually it's not at all. It's just the way the body works, and that's a perfectly natural, normal process. And I'm trying to watch my language today, because if I say the SHIT word, then we have to say it's an explicit content. So I'm trying really hard not to sweat.
Yeah, people tend to think that like it's the carbohydrates that is making them fat, and they need to realize that it's not. And like you said, carbohydrates hold at least 3 to 4 grams of water, and as soon as they cut that out of their diet, the weight plummets down, and it's usually in that first couple of weeks that it's going to happen, and then it starts to slow down after that. So yeah, it's not the carbs.
The thing is, the thing is as well, that the low carb advocates, we could call them, occultists, basically will try and also
What you say, cultists?
Yeah, is that a thing? Cultists.
I was just confirming.
I don't have to put that explicit mark on the. But essentially, like, they will try and shoehorn ways to justify their, So Jeff talked about insulin, and when insulin is elevated, basically, fat burning is put on hold. So like they see like insulin being this storage hormone and carbohydrates spiking that, therefore fat storage is kind of like guaranteed, and all of this sort of stuff. Even if you're in a calorie deficit, eating a high carb diet, you will gain fat, which just doesn't play out. But these people will look for these mechanisms and all of these sorts of stuff. A lot of the data is going to be anecdotal as well. Such and such cut out carbs, and now they're happier than ever and stuff like that. But a lot of people, when they do, as we said, they cut out a lot of highly processed foods, and maybe we know these people become more, I guess, health seeking, and they start being more considerate of their protein intake. We know like people tend to eat more protein on a lower carb diet. They seem to go between, like, they go high protein, higher fat, lower carb, and then when they're eating a high carb it's almost like protein goes out the window. So there's so many like numerous factors that are generally leading to somebody's long-term dietary success. But I guess with carbs, it's the simplicity of the rule that has its success. Like cut carbs, that's a huge amount of people's diets, like a huge amount that they just may overeat. So when they have this simple thing, which again is a source of calories, they reduce caloric intake. And yes, there's going to be that initial drop, but what we know is then the kind of the fat loss trend follows along with maybe a high carb, low fat diet with protein equated. You know, it just tends to go the same kind of pace.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what all the research really seems to be leaning toward, is exactly what Ian was describing there. So this just isn't kind of our miscellaneous opinions on this stuff, when there's plenty of controlled trials that have been done that look at comparing very tightly controlled studies where they look at this, where they compare diets where they're high fat, low carb, or almost zero carb, and protein is equated with a high carb, low fat diet where calories and protein are equated, physical activity levels are equal, and they find exactly what we also observe when working with people, which is it really doesn't matter which approach you're taking. When calories and protein are equal, the fat loss occurs at the similar rate. Weight maintenance occurs in the same way, or weight gain. So it really does come down to that protein and total calorie intake that is the determining factor. And it's just time and time again, whenever they look at this stuff in the research, that's what they're finding.
We spoke about last week how one of the most important things with fat loss is muscle preservation. And two things, like insulin is anti-catabolic, so it prevents that breakdown of muscle also, but the performance benefits, as Jeff said, like earlier in his awesome introduction, that essentially it's very anaerobic based activity, such as resistance training. So when we are in the gym and making the most of that kind of like time, if we're on a very low carbohydrate based diet, like performance is going to be potentially like negative in comparison to a higher or an appropriate kind of carbohydrate amount.
Yeah, we see this with all kinds of different training too. Even endurance athletes, where they're running, they're typically more at an intensity level, especially high level endurance athletes are going to be at a level where their body is very efficiently burning fat for fuel. And again, not body fat, especially if you look at a lot of these long distance runners, they don't have any body fat. But what we find is that some of these endurance runners and endurance athletes, they may train in a low carbohydrate state, but when it's time to perform at their peak, what do? They eat carbs, and that's just, it's really interesting when you start looking at even the people who are training their body to utilize fat as a fuel source most efficiently. When it comes to peak performance, they get those carbs right back in their body. And so it's just important to understand how it actually works.
Yeah, and quick release carbohydrates as well, something fast digesting and easy to consume, and something sugary. And that's probably something that we should talk about too, is sugar. The way that people will talk about sugar, but they seem to say it in a way that it's not a carbohydrate, but sugar is a carbohydrate. So, and then they get this whole, thing going where they can't eat fruit because of the sugar in the fruit. And then there's, the added sugar as well. But, you're going to get so much benefit out of eating fruit and fiber as well. Also, you're going to get that satiation with that as well. But with the added sugar, and that's not inherently bad for you either, but it is probably got more calories than what would be in fruit. But again, it's not inherently bad for you. It's just easily overconsumed. But then again, you don't eat sugar on its own, do you? It's always with something. So, that's why it's so easily consumed as well. It's because they add fat to it. They add more carbohydrates to it. So it just makes it taste that much better. But anybody want to add anything about sugar?
That's another thing people cut out. I missed a little bit of that because somebody came to the door and I had to answer it. But that's another thing that people assume is the devil. And again, it's always in the dose, isn't it? It's how much you have of this stuff. People just go extreme. Let's cut out sugar. I don't eat sugar anymore. Well, you can eat sugar, just don't go mad on it. Just moderate it like everything else.
I think as well, like a lot of people maybe like trying to think, well, how much of this do I need, and all of that sort of stuff in terms of sugar amounts, fiber amount, carbohydrates amount, and as we kind of want to get across is like everybody in terms of how much energy they expend are different. Therefore, it might take a little bit of time to kind of look at your diet, overall dietary intake, and whether or not it's appropriate given how physically active you are. So for me, stuff like sugar and all of those sorts of things can be supplementary to somebody's caloric needs. If somebody's very active, works in construction, or maybe even their training, if they're training first thing on the morning, they may not want a huge bowl of oats half an hour before the train. So like something fast digesting that's going to get into their system, like a cereal or some liquid stuff like Gatorade or Lucozade or something, and some whey protein just to get in so they're performing better than if they were fasted. So again, it's all like, it's not just dose, but it's also circumstance dependent. We know there is things like carbohydrate rinsing of the mouth, which has like performance benefits and things like that. So just the simple act of like putting it in there, automatically the body's releasing energy accordingly and everything like that. So we've got to look at the totality of things. So it's never this is good, this is bad, black and white. It's always about like, right, what is the big picture of this person's nutrition looking like? And that's why we can't like definitively look at one meal at one time being good or bad. The whole should you be eating that conversation, I thought you were on a diet. It's like, right, yeah, but how does that interlink with everything else that's going on in that person's life? You've got a snapshot.
And we have to remember that a lot of those foods, if you take performance out of the equation, just for normal people that are listening to us, is that, a lot of those foods we absolutely love eating. They are enjoyment. They give us satisfaction. They give us, they're things that we have at social occasions. What's the life without a bit of chocolate now and then? It's part of our life. And I mean, I don't know about you, but if people that have said, I've cut out sugar, I'm not eating sugar anymore. How long does that last? It's not long before those people will be head first into a tub of chocolate because they've restricted it for too long. It's always that extreme. We're not having it or we're having loads of it. It's that middle ground that if everyone could just try and be a bit more, boring as it might sound, moderate with their intake of things, there won't be so much of a problem. And these sort of myths and sort of hate on a certain macronutrient wouldn't exist.
I think it's easy. It's easy for the marketers to like solely focus on carbohydrates, and it gets very quick, rapid results, and that gets very quick, rapid buy-in. And that's what it's all about. It's more so on the psychology, seeing that number drop. Like we have boot camps within the local area, and they have like the whole lose 21 pounds in 4 weeks, get your money back. And, I've seen the framework of their diets, and they even get them at the last point to cut things like water, carbohydrates further, and all of these sorts of stuff. And it's like they're almost trying to do a weight making sport like powerlifting or MMA. And this is what they do. They dehydrate, they cut fiber because that adds bulk. They cut carbohydrates because they lose glycogen stores. They generally train in a high intense way. So you're getting not just the loss of these glycogen stores and the water alongside that, but you're not replenishing them either with carbohydrates. So what do you think is going to happen? But people end up like it's a bodybuilding term, but like stringy, so like, the muscles are very empty, but they've still got as much body fat. And like, again, talking about bodybuilding, there's studies from natural bodybuilders and they look at the composition of the diet. And as I said last week, these are the best people in the world at maintaining maximum amount of muscle mass and getting absolutely peeled, like losing lots and lots of body fat, pretty much all of it. And the majority of these have a high protein, moderate to high protein diet, high carb to low fat ratio within their, the composition of their intake.
So what about some of these myths then around carbs?
Oh, well, we did some before. So we did carbs make you fat, which they don't. It's a calorie surplus that will make you gain weight, not the carbs, and it's not sugar. I'm just trying to think of some other ones.
I think of another common one that comes to mind for me that I think probably a lot of our listeners and tons of people can relate to is, what about people with prediabetes or diabetes? Do they need to avoid carbs or minimize carbs? And just briefly, I'll just kind of mention one of the easy ways to mitigate that, because yes, carbs do have an impact on blood sugar, and so people that do have diabetes, especially pre-diabetes, not as much, but diabetes for sure, do need to be at least conscious of the impact of the carbs on their blood sugars, and so that they can manage it appropriately and adjust insulin levels if necessary. This is type 1 and type 2 diabetes. But what we do find is that when you have a mixed meal, which is what we always encourage our clients to do, right? We encourage them to eat protein, fat, and carbs at their meals. And when you do that, you also tend to mitigate the spikes in blood sugar that would come from just a heavy carb meal or just a pure sugar meal. So you can still enjoy carbs, you can still eat sugar, you can eat desserts when you're diabetic, and but by combining these other nutrients in those meals, then you can enjoy them.
Yeah. So I guess just to wrap a few things up before we finish off. Firstly, what about how much carbohydrates? People are always asking sort of how much carbohydrates should you eat then, if you can have them. So who wants to go there?
I think Sarah, as she said, they're not essential for life, but they are essential for optimal health. So what is essential for like life, essentially protein and fat. And I think that's where we can start building a diet around. And generally carbohydrates, once a baseline amount of protein and nutritional fat is met, then carbohydrates can make up the rest. But I tend to be quite flexible with that carbohydrate to fat ratio, given that there is a minimum fat threshold met. So protein tends to be more fixed, whereas obviously that carbohydrate to fat can give you a little bit more flexibility within your nutrition. So it's like a sliding scale. If fats go up, carbohydrates kind of come down, just to manage that calorie total. But you're going to recognize if you're having a high fat, high carb meal, that's going to be very calorically dense. But like for me, getting some just basic habits in place, like regulating your caloric intake as opposed to necessarily tracking it and like being overly numerical with it all, because that might just be overkill and over analyzing stuff. And maybe just more so dependent on what your goal is, just keeping an eye on the overall weight trend And that's going to tell you whether you're in a surplus or a deficit or a maintenance or not. And eating in accordance to like how you feel, how satiated you are, and maybe experimenting as well between like protein and a high fat, low carb meal, and a, you know, protein, high carb, low fat meal, and just giving a little bit of time to like explore what your appetite is like in the hours after those intakes. But like it's hard to definitively put like a number on like how many carbohydrates is good or bad. It's going to be dependent on how physically active you are as well.
I suppose if people wanted a number, they could focus on the fibre. So the recommended amount of fibre for an adult is about 30 grams a day. And I think on average, most people don't get close to half that amount. So if you are hitting or trying to hit your fibre of around 30 grams, your carbohydrate will probably be at a reasonable amount. But again, you know, just on a day-to-day basis, if you're someone that sits at an office desk all day, doesn't do any exercise and doesn't get much activity, both your calories and your carb intake won't need to be as high as somebody that trains several times a week and has an active job. You know, it's some of it is common sense. And as Ian says, there's no right or wrong particularly. But I think what I tend to say to people is, rather than say, I'm having pasta for tea, say, well, I'm having chicken and I'm having some pasta with it. So your ratios are more biased towards protein than the pasta. I mean, obviously on occasions it's fine to have a meal that isn't perfect and doesn't hit all the spot, but on an average sort of across the week, if you're trying to hit your protein first, get your fat, and then just balance the rest out with carbs, sort of as Ian was saying, you're not going to go too far wrong, really.
Yeah, I would agree on the amount of carbs. I like what Ian said. You know, that sliding scale. You know, if your fat increases, your carbs will probably come down, and vice versa. And from an intuitive eating perspective, I'll just bring that in. We would encourage people to listen to their body and the cravings that it has, because our bodies do often direct us towards certain kinds of foods when we need them. You know, when our protein is low, it's still driving us to eat more. And so it's good to then start to be mindful of what it is that we've been eating. You know, if we find I sure ate quite a bit today, but I don't know, for some reason I'm really hungry. Well, I had a bunch of cereal and I haven't had much protein and I haven't had much in the way of complex carbohydrates. And so now you can start to say, oh, okay, well, if I just am more mindful of including some more complex carbohydrates, and it may help my appetite to get back in check. You know, when we're listening to that, what our body is telling us when it needs more food or less food, that kind of thing, then when we do increase fat, then we're going to naturally eat less carbs because our body is telling us that we don't need any more food, and vice versa. If we decrease fat, then we're probably going to be driven to eat more carbs. So from that perspective, if you're listening to your body and what it's telling you from an appetite and hunger and satiety perspective, then it does tend to just help you eat the amount of carbs that your body will need. Now, performance is a whole different ballgame, because I think when you have specific performance needs, then you do need to be a bit more mindful of those different macros and what you do need. You know, if you're somebody who's engaged in a really high intensity type of activity, then you need to be conscious of including a higher carb intake in your diet. But like Sarah was saying too, if you're relatively sedentary, desk job, and not moving around a lot, you really don't need a lot of carbs.
I think we've missed the most glaring myth there is: not eating carbs after 6 p.m.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes, definitely.
6 p.m. As soon as them hands hit that time on that clock, don't eat carbs before bed. And again, I just think a lot of people, they usually weigh themselves on a morning. So if you've had a load of carbs just before bed, usually you've had a lot of water with it, maybe a bit of salt as well if it's a mixed meal, and you've added seasoning. And, you know, of course, that's going to show up on the scale. Like, we had a roast last night, and that shows up on the scale hugely. A lot of fiber, a lot of bulk, a lot of volume. But people need to realize that when they're trying to lose weight, what they're actually trying to say is, I'm trying to lose body fat. And one of the best ways to manage that is managing appetite successfully. And I guess, I mean, we're probably going to do a podcast around intuitive eating. And I think because the way the world works now, it's quite hard to get in touch with that intuition. It'll take time and practice. And there's, you know, actual hunger versus this emotional hedonic hunger that is maybe triggered by just something as simple as the smell of pizza in the air or walking past a shop or something like that. So it's very challenging to navigate that space. And that's what we're kind of trying to give people an insight over. But yeah, the 6 p.m. carbohydrate rule. And I guess the theory is that, you know, when you've got these carbohydrates in your system, you're not going to burn them off because you're going to bed. Therefore, they're going to automatically store as body fat. But as hopefully people are gathering, it is the totality of calories in versus calories out.
Yeah, I think just so we don't forget to mention this, carbs actually don't store as body fat very easily. So that's something that I think Ian was talking about this on one of his social media posts recently, is that our body stores the fat from our diet. The carb intake brings up our total calorie intake, so that if we're in a surplus, then our body will begin to store the fat. It only starts storing carbohydrate as fat under certain circumstances where we're significantly overfeeding ourselves with calories. And so it's actually not very easy for the body to convert glucose into fat for storage. So that's something that I think that's another myth. I think a lot of people think that carbs immediately are stored as fat, and that's just not the case.
Yeah, that gets said a lot, doesn't it? You will see that a lot.
Yeah, it's a really hard process for the body to go through for it to actually convert carbs to fat anyway. So yeah. Just wrapping up, I guess, with carbohydrates, it's really just a case of, making sure you get plenty of vegetables, fruit within your diet. Still have potatoes, still have bread. You can still have all the carbs if you like. They're not going to make you fat. It's going to be the surplus of calories that does that. I think, has anybody else got anything to add before we finish off?
No, I just want everyone just to say potato, because I've realised like how differently we all say it. So I think we should just say it each. So like potato.
Potato. I'm saying it like you. Potato.
Potato. Potato. Yeah.
Go on in.
Tater.
Potato. Tatty.
Potato.
Why are you going on like I'm Irish? I'm not Irish. Through an Irish accent there.
Sandy did her very best English accent.
It was very good.
Potato. I like the way we mash potatoes. That's an English way.
Now you said it normally.
Yeah. The most versatile food there is. You can make vodka from potatoes as well.
Yeah.
That's why Sarah loves potatoes.
I don't like vodka. Maybe.
She has potatoes for breakfast and
yeah.
So.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for another great episode, and make sure you follow us on Instagram and join our Facebook group, The Habit Shift, and also on our podcast. And I think that's all I have to add. So thanks, guys. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.